Good day. Welcome to Westchester Talk Radio, westchestertalkradio.com, produced by Sharc Creative. I'm John Marino. This is the Cup of Joe political show. We are made possible by Robeson Oil, the house that Service built, by Hightower Westchester, managing your wealth to a fiduciary standard, by Michael Labriola, landscape design and construction of Armonk, and by Jaguar Land Rover of New Rochelle, White Plains, and Mount Kisco. Also by Tompkins Mahopac Bank. Here on the Cup of Joe political show, we are joined by Westchester 12th District County Legislator Mary Jane Shimsky. She returns to our program. Mary Jane Shimsky's area, the 12th District, consists of the Hudson River towns from Hastings all the way up to Irvington, right near the Tappan Zee Bridge. It juts inward a bit and covers parts of Greenburgh, the Edgemont section of Scarsdale, and Hartsdale, part of Greenburgh also, too. Mary Jane Shimsky, welcome back. It's been an interesting year so far dealing with Omicron, now BA2, and yet we see, and I think I'm guilty of this to some extent too, we want to reopen, we want to get our lives back to normal after 2 years, and yet that still may not be, as of the moment, the totally smartest way to go.
Well, historians have said that the psychological end of a pandemic happens before the biological end of the pandemic. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. Fortunately, we're getting into the warmer months. So I am hoping that people will still do a lot of what we've done the last couple years in terms of moving events outside, because those are always lower risk. I hope people are still getting vaccinated, making sure they're boosted as they're supposed to be, depending on their age group. We just had the announcement a day or two ago that people over 50 can now get a second booster if they choose. But we're not done with this. Now, what's interesting is I suspect, based on what I've heard about the new variants, that the people who are going to, again, get hit the worst are the unvaccinated. And of course, it's frequently the unvaccinated who have not taken this seriously. So they're more likely to get sick because they're engaging in more risky behaviors. And then they're going to be in a situation where they're probably going to suffer more adverse consequences from it.
Mm-hmm. I walked up to the door of a store yesterday and I looked down and I saw big blue circles that still said, keep your distance 6 feet apart. And there was nobody around me at that time, but I looked around, they had it laid out all across the street. So that's a reminder to us, I think, to not let our guard down right now and proceed accordingly. I know health officials are worried about, yes, like you pointed out, summer months here and we can do things outdoors, but what happens in the fall? What might the variant be at that point? Might we go back to an Omicron type situation again? And yet we are still trying to move out of the pandemic step by step as best as possible. The county board this year in 2022, how much does COVID play into the funding for the 2022 budget and what the game plan is?
At this point, it seems to play more in how we conduct the floor. We still have the bulk of our public participation being done remotely at this point. More legislators come into the office for meetings, but Governor Hochul has extended, at least through mid-April, our ability to attend meetings remotely. And I have to admit, when I'm in the committee room, John, if there are only a few of us, I sit back and relax. When the room gets crowded, I usually remember to put my mask back on because, the thing about elected officials, and this is why it's so important for elected officials to set examples with being vaccinated, masking and everything else, because we spend so much time around so many different groups of people. We can be the biggest disease vectors going, and we have to be really conscious of that. And I know I try to be. I know that most of my colleagues still try to be. In terms of funding and the like, because of all of the federal money that has come through in the last couple of years, I have not noted any budgetary problems on a county level. But of course, people are already talking on the federal level about whether we have enough money in the pipeline to make sure that we are ready to fight the new variants as they come. And I assume that problem, unless it gets solved at the federal level, will trickle down to the state and local levels soon enough.
Right. We still have to conduct business day to day, regardless of how much money we might have in the coffers. The key issues in 2022, as you see them right now, again, as we try to move out of the pandemic, a lot of the old issues are still with us. For example, what we've talked about before, infrastructure, and with that transit too, and the changes along the MTA board, et cetera, and the issues of crime and whether or not people want to get on a Metro North train and they have to work in Midtown, they want to get back to their office, and yet they don't want to get on the subway.
All of the above, obviously. Westchester County really has led the way in crime fighting. Our major crime statistics have actually dropped in recent times. And a lot of that is because we've got good, vigilant local police departments. We've got a strong probation department who is able to supervise people who may need that supervision to bridge into a more responsible adulthood. But in the city, there are still clearly problems. And the more I hear about them, I tend to think that a lot of the problems are a result of, we've already saw before COVID that there's been a rise in mental health problems in our society. And COVID, with the shutdowns and the isolation and the fear, has just made it worse. And it seems as if almost every day there's a new horror story coming out of the city. I don't know if you heard about the one over the weekend, but there's a gentleman and his son run a pizza shop, and they went out to be good Samaritans to help an Asian woman who was being attacked. And they ended up getting
Pizza Shop in Queens, in Elmhurst.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And apparently they're all expected to survive. Last I heard, they were all in the hospital. Mm-hmm. 2 of the 3 assailants have been caught. I don't know about the third. But the woman was Asian. So to what extent the whole, on top of all the COVID mental health issues, you also have a lot of the racism that was pushed by certain political personages whose names I will not mention on the show right now. They all know who they are. And in those situations, there's a lot that has to be tackled. It is a law enforcement problem on one level, but it's more than a law enforcement problem.
The father and son say, for example, they stepped in, did what they did because they say the politicians have not done enough. So it has to trickle down to the street and neighborhood level where you have to protect yourself. Have we tried to do enough, knowing that you can't get everything done?
I don't know what the city has been doing in terms of mental health, crisis intervention, or general mental health providing of services. I do know that the new mayor has a new initiative, which of course he's trying to get homeless people largely out of the subway system on the theory that they are responsible for most, if not all, of the uptick in crime. How that is going to work remains to be seen, both in terms of getting them out in the first place and whether or not that's going to end up being the magic bullet, whether there is a magic bullet. I think all of us have seen things that we never would have seen a couple years ago. People losing their tempers in businesses, We may not get attacked on the subway, but we have to drive on roads and highways. And you've seen some of the stuff that people have been doing on our roads and highways.
Right.
So there's a lot of frustrating and dangerous behavior that's going on all levels. And like I said, I think primarily a lot of this is a mental health issue. The one thing I will say about the stabbings that have been taking place is we have people seriously injured, an occasional death because of stabbings. Just imagine if we lived in a place where there were guns everywhere. Any one of those incidents, instead of a couple people being stabbed, could be half a dozen or a dozen people dead.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we still have to deal with in New York is the iron pipeline, where guns that are gotten in states where they're plentiful, generally down south, although some of it's now coming from the Midwest as well, are being illegally sold on our streets.
And how do we rectify that problem? Because this has been a problem for decades. We've talked gun control before. Somebody said to me the other day, well, we have amongst the toughest gun laws in the country, to which I said, does that mean we can't make them tougher and more effective somehow? Because to me, that's what it comes down to. Shut down that iron pipeline, and most of the guns that we see in this area will be gone.
I think that there may still be things we can investigate doing, in terms of criminal law, in terms of investigating what's going on with these vehicles coming across state lines. Although that gets tricky too, because how do you tell one white van from another white van, right, or what have you? But the biggest problem with that, John, is federal. And you can tie the rising numbers of incidents, the rising numbers of injuries and deaths to a federal government that has let gun laws with sunset dates lapse, a Senate that refuses to do even the most elemental things that the vast majority of gun owners think makes sense. Should someone with serious mental illness be allowed to carry a gun? You can say they have Second Amendment rights, but didn't that whole class of first graders in Sandy Hook have rights too?
Right. Or down in Parkland, Florida.
And unfortunately, if we sat here long enough, we could brainstorm a very long
We
list.
could talk about a number of places and take up the rest of the show doing that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I've always thought, too, it's a federal problem, federal issue. Why don't the feds issue one blanket set of gun laws that cover everybody across the country? People come back and say, well, we have individual rights. People in Alabama don't think the way you do up here in New York. I understand life is different down there. It's a lot more rural and the culture is totally different. And yet to protect, I try to present it from a standpoint of it's about everybody's protection, not just us here in New York and in the Northeast. We have carjacking. That's become a problem again. We have, maybe this leads to issues like, do we do enough for our young people? Let's say during the summertime. When I grew up in East Harlem and Manhattan, I was fortunate enough to have a couple of anti-getting in trouble programs available to me that my parents were lucky enough to have a couple of friends who ran these programs. And my parents said to me when I was 13, 14, 15, in March, we already know what you're doing during the summer. You're going to work and you're going to be part of these programs, like it or not. And I wasn't too happy with it at that time. You want to run the streets at that age, but you realize your parents did the right thing. You were fortunate that they were able to get you into these programs, and it helped me stay on track. I don't see enough of this on my end through the years. Maybe we're starting to get back in that direction again of getting the kids off the streets during the holidays, during the summer, and maybe getting kids to become maybe more, I hate to use the term productive members of society, but at that age in the programs I was in, we were expected to do something and be productive.
Right. by the way, my children still use that phrase. So there's a certain timeless quality about it, John.
Mm-hmm.
But I know in Westchester County, the bulk of our communities do an awful lot. They have a lot of programs, either through the schools, through not-for-profits, through the municipal governments. The county helps fund those. And they may be part of the reason why we've been able to keep crime under control to a very large extent in Westchester.
For example, midnight basketball in Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, White Plains, Peekskill, Ossining.
Remember when
like
people
that.
used to make fun of Bill Clinton in the 90s for suggesting that?
Right, exactly. And I've had
And
my
you know what?
discussions
He went
through the
ahead
years
and
with
he
people
did it.
about that.
And the studies prove that they're effective in saving lives.
Mm-hmm. Or as I said to someone once, if there's a game at 3 a.m., we get kids off the street, I'll be there with them at 3 a.m. too. Make sure you're there. Midnight, 2 a.m., whatever it is. We got a game, we get kids. We try to be helpful towards them, get them off the streets together, doing something productive. I'll bet we'll have a bunch of kids who know what to do in life when the time comes.
Mm-hmm. All sounds right to me, John. And as I said, we have so many organizations and levels of government that are really focused on that here in Westchester. I know that there may be a few communities who are a little behind the curve on that, but they're beginning to realize that they have a problem too.
Child care, are we doing enough for that around the county?
We're doing a lot more than we did. I mean, we put record amounts of child care subsidies in the budget this year, which just in terms of reopening the economy, it was critical, because one of the reasons leading to the Great Resignation that a lot of people don't talk about is because somebody had to stay home with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want people back in the workforce, you are going to have to provide a place for their children to be that's safe, that's educational, and that's stable, so parents can go back to work. So we were going to have to do something anyway, but between having George Latimer in office and having a critical mass of legislators on the board, either being women, being people who have kids, so they get it, they understand it. We put in a record amount of funding for childcare this year. And that was also important because during COVID, a lot of childcare centers really suffered economically. Everybody knows about their local restaurants, but the same forces at work caused childcare centers to close or put surviving childcare centers in severe economic distress. So we tried to raise the reimbursement rate to something more reasonable, which is something that had actually been asked for years. So it's something that many people said we needed for a long time, but certainly under the circumstances as they've recently evolved, it was definitely necessary. We've tried to put in money so that parents who might dribble over income limits still have a chance to get some subsidy and some help so they could keep their children in a good, stable situation.
Are we educationally about back to normal, at least just about post-COVID there, knowing that anything can happen?
Well, I think I would say it may look that way on paper, but it's not really that way. There's still a lot of tension. Lately, the parents who wanted the masks off, the kids back in school, many of whom buy into the COVID denial stuff, but some of whom don't, but had honest concerns about what it was all doing to their children psychologically. They've been getting a lot of the publicity, but as we're going back, there is the backlash from a lot of parents who are fearful of having their kids go back to school, either because of their children's medical condition, because of close family members' medical condition, so they're afraid of what the kids are going to bring home. And everybody is still on edge. It goes back to what we were talking about before, between the crime on the subway, the, dare I say, criminal driving we see on the roads every day. Those psychological forces are still working in our schools too. So things are not back to normal. They're a lot closer than they used to be, but they're not back to normal. And one of the things we really have to do, I mean, I've talked a lot on this show and throughout my whole political career about infrastructure. And anyone who tries to walk down our streets, much less drive down them, knows the serious need. But we also have a burgeoning need with mental health services.
Mary Jane Shimsky, County Legislator, represents the 12th District, running from Hastings up the Hudson River to Irvington, right near the Tappan Zee, and cutting inland into the town of Greenburgh, the Edgemont section of Scarsdale, and Hartsdale too. Mary Jane Shimsky here on Westchester Talk Radio, the Cup of Joe political show. I'm John Marino. Mary Jane Shimsky, the next step for political people sometimes is the next office above where they are right now. You've been on the county board for a number of years. You look up, you see George Latimer, who worked his way from the city council in Rye back in the 80s to where he is now as the county executive. He served on the county board, he served in the assembly, served in the state senate. And Tom Abenanti is a contemporary of George. He began back on the county board back in the late 80s, early 90s, and worked his way up to the state assembly. He represents the 92nd district, covers a whole good portion of the area that you represent on the county board. Greenburgh, also part of the town of Mount Pleasant as well, too, the 92nd Assembly District. You have announced that you are challenging Tom Abenanti for that office in the Democratic primary in June of this year. Now, I do want to point out that, at least to me, politically, a lot of what you've done and much of what he's done through the years has been and is very similar, without knowing what goes on when people work together and in negotiations. From things that I've seen through the years, seems like the two of you, I'll bet, work together on a number of things along the way. Why challenge Tom Abenanti at this point?
Okay, let me start in the beginning. I guess it was before the 2020 primary. I actually had what I considered almost an alarming number of people, most of whom from the 92nd district, urging me to take a look at it at that point. And essentially there were two reasons that people came to me about. One was Tom's vote against ending the religious exemption for vaccines. Tom has had a history during his whole time in the assembly of trying to make it easier for people to refuse to get vaccinated and get their children vaccinated. And this was just one more piece of that.
Mm-hmm. I saw something in print that said you thought he didn't do enough during COVID. So I would assume this is one of those issues?
This is one of those issues. And the second thing that people talk to me about, and this is the kind of thing that people don't see, but can be very, very important, is a lot of people just had the sense that he did not have the interpersonal relation skill set to be as effective on many of the things we need him to be effective on.
For example, now, which issues?
Well, what I would say is this. This is a big issue time. We've got climate change. We've got resiliency against climate change, which is actually in many ways a separate issue, dealing with flooding, dealing with the reliability of our utility services, and so on. You've got public health challenges. Because of climate change, we may not have to wait for another 100 years to get our next pandemic blowing through. And we're still not done with COVID, as we discussed. We are developing a level of housing affordability crisis that I'm finding very alarming. I've spent some time the last several years in Los Angeles because one of my children went to college out there. So I see what happens when even most working people cannot afford a decent roof over their heads. And the problem is, it gets a lot colder in the winter here than it does in Los Angeles. So we've got a lot of issues. And these are not the kind of things that we can just check off a box and say, see, I introduced this and I voted to pass this. I'm good on climate change. Let's move on. We have to solve the problems, because if we don't solve the problems, many of these crises either are existential or border on the existential. And we could list a whole number more. Mental health may be falling into that category. We've got human rights issues we talked about the racist attacks that are going on against the Asian population, for example. These are not things that you just introduce a bill and say, see, I'm good, reelect me. We have to solve the problem. When you're talking about something like climate change, it will probably take dozens of pieces of legislation, in addition to major investments year in, year out for a large number of years. It's going to take a lot of negotiation with the federal government and with our local governments to help what we legislate, to help the right policy choices filter where they have to filter. And then we need to communicate effectively with our communities.
How do you answer someone who says, for example, well, what can you do locally about climate change? It's way above us in White Plains, in Somers, in Hastings, and Dobbs Ferry. It's something that the feds, like gun control, maybe should do a lot more about. And, oh, by the way, it's a global issue, too. So what can we do in Greenberg about it?
Well, what we could do in New York State is we can accelerate the move to away from fossil fuels, electrify our vehicles. There are new electric cooking technologies that are just about as good as gas stoves. Gas stoves leak an awful lot of methane, John. And we need to phase them out as well. And by the way, some of the leading chefs in this nation are now using some of the new electric technologies and are quite happy with them. Gas heat, oil heat, we need to move that away. While we're doing that, we also have to accelerate the investment, which will probably take tens of billions of dollars in the space of several years to move away from fossil fuel generated electricity into more renewable sources. The third thing we have to do is we have to make things more sustainable by reducing the amount of energy we need in the first place, whether it's energy conservation in our buildings, whether it's better using more recycled materials in our roads, in our buildings, in our concrete. There are things we can do which we are not necessarily requiring or enforcing on the state level. We need to do more of that. And I know that the state Senate has actually done more than the Assembly on a lot of these things. So what we need to do is join forces, work cooperatively with the state Senate, and move forward with legislation and with funding at budget time to make sure these things happen. And remember, when we were talking about social justice and racial justice, there's a big component of that with all the climate change technologies as well. Let's go to communities that still have high unemployment rates and make sure that their people are trained in the new technologies. Let's make sure that we don't keep building dirty technologies near poor residential neighborhoods. I mean, there's so many pieces to this. It's an existential crisis, not just because of storms and sea level rise and all of that, but the way it corrodes other parts of our society as well. Now, I can talk about a whole number of issues like that, but the idea is you need someone who is going to have the persistence, who is going to work and play well with others, and who is going to understand that it's not just about checking a box or two. It's about coming up with real solutions to major problems.
Mary Jane Shimsky, this Assembly District, the 92nd, you are no stranger to the offices there, the office itself, because you came up through the ranks working for Tom Abenanti's predecessor, the legendary guy who we all knew and loved for a long time, the late Richard Brodsky. And I do have to say, it's just hard to believe it's 2 years already since he passed away. Yeah. What would this mean to you personally if the voters of Westchester decided that you are the right person, the appropriate person to represent the 92nd district in Albany?
You know, let me go back to what Franklin Roosevelt did when he found out he was first elected. And the full force and fury of all the problems the country was facing fell on him at that moment. And he went for divine intervention. And the thing about it is, though, he understood that it was really more a humbling experience than anything else. Given the way I feel about my public service, I will, regardless, I would feel it a very humbling experience. But knowing that Richard set the bar so high adds to that. But at the same time, I also know what the spirit of Richard Brodsky was. And I learned an awful lot from working in that office. Some people say, well, if you only work on this, that's all you know. But a smart person who applies themselves sees everything that's going on in an office. And I've learned an awful lot. And I would consider it an honor to try to continue to burnish that legacy.
What was the key to his success? People would say to me back then in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, well, I don't know how you get along with Rich the way you do. He can be tough to deal with sometimes. I said, no, it's not that. It's that he believes in what he believes in. And if he understands, if you don't agree with that he wants to hear from you and what you have to say about it. And you saying that, well, he can be tough to get along with doesn't get it done. Talk with Rich. He's open to what you have to say. He wants to hear what you have to say. And I'll bet you can work something out and reach a happy medium with him. And I found that always key to my success, to his success. And I thought we worked well together through the years on the old WFAS radio in White Plains. And I always found him accessible and always there, ready to go at a moment's notice, at the drop of a hat on an issue, and that he would always tell you what he thought, whether you agreed with it or not.
That's absolutely right. And the qualities I think that are important to remember is, number one, he really was a great negotiator. He could come on kind of strong, but he knew how to negotiate. He knew how to come to compromise, and he respected the people on the other side. And it's that you cannot just lightly dismiss people and say, well, they disagree with me, so that doesn't work. You have to be able to talk to people you disagree with and come to some sort of accommodation with each other. And he actually ended up being quite good at that.
I thought he was one of the best at that in his day. He knew how to get things done. That's what it's about if you are a public official. Mary Jane Shimsky, we'll talk again before the primary. Best of luck this primary season as you challenge Tom Abenanti. We will reach out to Tom and have him come on with us too, as he has been a guest from time to time as well. And here on Westchester Talk Radio, the Cup of Joe political show, 12th District County Legislator Mary Jane Shimsky. Again, we thank you, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you. Great to have you again with us here on the Cup of Joe political show, produced by Sharc Creative, Westchester Talk Radio, made possible by Robeson Oil, the house that service built. By Lipolis Electric, don't be left in the dark. Get Lipolis. By Hightower Westchester, managing your wealth to a fiduciary standard. By Michael Labriola, landscape design and construction of Armonk. By Jaguar Land Rover of White Plains, New Rochelle, and Mount Kisco by Tompkins Mahopac Bank. Catch all of our Westchester, Rockland, Putnam, Dutchess, Orange, and Fairfield County talk radio programming on our YouTube channel, Sharc Creative YouTube, and download our app. It's called Westchester Talk. Take it with you anywhere and everywhere you go 24/7.